Story 1. A body was found on Somerton Beach, dead and propped up against a seawall. There was no obvious cause of death. The man had no identification. No one claimed the body, and he matched no missing person's description. In the 40s, this wasn't completely unheard of, so it wasn't big news. But then, the case got weird. In tracing his path based on the train bus tickets they found in his pockets, they discovered his suitcase, which also had no identification. In fact, labels were cut out of the clothes. It wasn't that someone lifted his wallet when they found his body. He'd purposely hidden his identity ahead of time. A second examination of the body revealed a tightly rolled up piece of paper with the words Tamam Shud on it, loosely translated to "It is ended," hidden in a watch pocket of his pants. Someone came forward with a copy of a popular poetry book, the Rubaiyat, that they had found in the backseat of their car near where the body was found. And the last page, which should have contained the words Tamam Shud, was torn out. Except when police tried to trace this version of the book, it had never been printed anywhere. Although the book was popular, the typeset size and shape of this copy were unique in the world. The back of the book had a mysterious code written in it and 2 phone numbers. Actually, it had been written on the torn-out back page, but the indents were still visible on the back cover. One number was a bank, the other was a nurse who lived blocks away from the beach. The nurse insisted she didn't know the man, but when shown the body, detectives agreed she appeared to recognize him. The nurse had been an army nurse during the war and had been known to give copies of the poetry book away to another man, an army intelligence officer. The nurse's identity was kept secret for many years, but within the past year her children have come forward and said she confided to them that she did know the man, but never gave any details on how, and that she was a spy during the war. The code written in the book was never cracked, even though virtually every code breaker in the world, amateur and professional for the past 60+ years, has given it a go. Oh, and that poetry book, the Rubaiyat? Another copy of it, also unique in the world. Its title page said it was a 7th edition, but the publishing house had only printed 5 editions of it. Was linked to another mysterious death of a high-ranking government official. He was found dead in a park with the book open on his chest. A woman who testified at the inquest of his death was found dead in her bathtub, wrists slit open. And guess who frequented the hotel bar across the street from the park he was found in, and had given a copy of the book to another man there 2 months after he died? The nurse. The article linked gives a much more thorough explanation, with a few weird theories. Highly recommend checking it out. Such a creepy case. Story 2. The Sodder Children. On December 24, 1945, Johnny Sodder, mother of 9 children, went to bed in their family home in Fayetteville, West Virginia. Some of them were allowed to stay up while she did so, and she fell asleep. She was woken at midnight by a phone call, and a woman's voice asked if someone Jeannie didn't recognize was there. Then it laughed and hung up. She also reported hearing noises on the roof. After having fallen asleep again, she woke up in the early hours of the morning to the smell of smoke. Finding the house on fire, she and her husband managed to rescue 4 of the children, but when looking for their ladder, the husband found it missing, and none of the family's trucks were working to go and get help with it. 5 children went missing, and though apparently bones and organs were found in the ashes of the house, they were deemed by a coroner to belong to an animal. Then, Mrs. Sodder received a letter postmarked from Kentucky in 1968 that contained a picture of a young man. With Louis Sodder, "I love my brother Frankie, Elil Boys, A90132 or 35, written onto the back. The family still believes their children were kidnapped and possibly taken to Italy, as I recall, the family having moved from there to the US years previously. Story 3. I live next to a trailer that is for rent. When my house was built, someone placed a trailer right on the edge of the property line, so it is unusually close to my bedroom window. There were months when it was empty save for a blue light in the back bedroom. One night, curiosity got the better of me and I went and peeked in the window. It was a TV that was left on and was on the default input screen. The freaky part was that the entire floor was covered in plastic and the place had been cleaned out except for a freaky-looking doll that was on the bed. The night after I looked, I woke up with a blue light on my TV in my bedroom. This was strange because I had turned the TV off and I never went to the input screen on my TV. I got up, turned on some lights, made a drink, and then made my way back to the bedroom to try and get back to sleep. I couldn't help but glance over at the trailer and see the blue light shining, as it always does. The next night, after at least 3 months of constantly being on, the blue light disappeared and never returned. Crazy coincidence? Probably, but still freaky. Now that all happened years ago. 3 other people have come and gone since then, the last moving out probably 9 months ago. It had snowed one night, and my girlfriend noticed tracks leading across my yard to the trailer. This was weird as no one lived there, or had even checked on it in months. There was trash that sat on the porch and a flyer on the doorknob that never moved. I went out with a flashlight and saw a strange set of tracks that came almost directly from the front porch. The only reason I couldn't say for sure is that some of the snow on the porch had melted, but it was a straight line, with no other tracks anywhere else. The tracks were of one large boot. Yes, just one. They went from the porch, across my yard, and right up to about 10 feet away from my bedroom window. Then they stopped. There were no return tracks and there was only a right foot. I studied those tracks for hours and could not figure any of them out. I even have a security camera pointed almost exactly where the tracks are because I've had some theft from my carport. I rewatched the tape and saw nothing because they conveniently ended about 3 inches off camera. I had my girlfriend stand on the tracks and wave her arms out. I could see her hand barely, so it was close, but there was nothing. I still can't figure out why there was only 1 foot, why someone would come and stand facing my bedroom stop, and how someone could retrace a single footstep backward. Also, the stride of the step was very large. I will entertain any plausible explanations. Story 4. Lori Erica Kennedy. Seriously, Google her, creepy as shit. A woman believed to be from the Pacific Northwest stole a birth certificate and started a new life. But there are absolutely 0 accounts or evidence of her before 1988. She married and had a baby before killing herself post-divorce in 2010, which was when her ex-husband found the birth certificate and name change docs buried in her closet. The only theory I've seen that's remotely plausible is that she's an escapee from an FLDS community. It could explain that she never did have her birth certificate, and more than one person pointed out a similarity between her and an FLDS prophet's family that got into some serious trouble in the 80s. Story 5. William and his wife, Margaret Patterson, left their home at 3000 Piedmont Avenue the night of March 5th, 1957, or possibly early the next morning. Without any indication they intended to be away more than a few hours. The house was found in disarray with dishes unwashed, underwear, and a pair of Mrs. Patterson's stockings on a bed, and other indications the Pattersons did not know they were leaving for a long time. Tommy, the yellow and white cat that was Mrs. Patterson's most precious possession, also was left behind. Their automobiles were left at their house. There was no sign of a struggle. Associates of the Pattersons told authorities in the 1950s that the couple left to go on an extended vacation to Florida, and later, that they sent word that they weren't coming back. A friend of the Pattersons reported the couple missing on August 15, 1957, 5 months after they were last seen in El Paso. A neighbor stated that she was at the Pattersons' home the night they disappeared and that Mrs. Patterson seemed very upset, and Mr. Patterson seemed unhappy that the neighbor was there. The neighbors also noted unusual activity at the Pattersons later that night. El Paso authorities convened a rare court of inquiry, also known as an inquest, to look into the couple's whereabouts, but the inquiry failed to find them. The Pattersons owned Patterson Photo Supply near downtown. Patterson also owned an interest in a high-end boat company, property in Guaymas, Mexico, a house, a boat, and a Cadillac. Associates told police that William Patterson had sent written instructions on how he wanted to dispose of his business and private properties. A letter signed W.D. Patterson stated that Patterson wanted his properties to be distributed among Doyle D.G. Kirkland, a friend and manager of Duffy's Photo Supply Store, his business auditor, and an employee of Patterson who was 24 at the time. It was unusual for Patterson to leave his property to those people, considering that he had at least 2 living relatives at the time, his father and a sister. Kirkland was the last person who was at the Patterson house before the couple vanished. He was helping Patterson work on his boat in the garage at the house. Several sightings of the couple were reported in Mexico and the United States, but sheriff's officials were never able to confirm any of them. The case was reopened in 1984 when an undocumented worker who was hired to clean the home after the Pattersons vanished said he saw blood under and around the water heater in the garage and a piece of human scalp on the propeller of Patterson's boat. He found a pair of jeans with a Rolex watch that belonged to Patterson and said he also saw one of Patterson's associates remove bloody sheets from the home and put them inside the trunk of a car. He did not talk to the police sooner because he was an illegal immigrant at the time. Story 6. This is a personal story, not a well-known one unless you're from the area. Last year on July 6th, my grandparents' aunt and uncle set out for their little round country, United States vacation. Usually it's just my grandparents, but my aunt and uncle went with them too. I believe it had something to do with their anniversary coming up. Anyways, they got to Colorado, and their camper was having some mechanical issues, so they pulled over and called someone to come help. They weren't too far away from the national park, Mesa Verde. So my aunt and uncle decided to go hiking for a little bit. My aunt wasn't in the best shape at the time. I'm not even going to sugarcoat it. She was pretty overweight and had some medical issues. They got to a smaller trail off one of the main trails, and my uncle, being the nature lover he was, wanted to go down the trail. My aunt didn't want to go because it wasn't smart in her condition, so he set off by himself. Keep in mind, this trail would have taken a seasoned hiker 1 hour to finish, so my aunt waits around at the end of the trail. My uncle never came out of the trail. Most people would say, oh, it's a nature trail. Maybe something happened and he fell or got attacked by a wild animal. Nope. They sent out search parties, searched dogs, and helicopters, and they found nothing. The dogs followed his scent for a while, and then out of nowhere, it disappeared. The weird part is that a few miles away on a completely different trail, there was a family that claimed they saw my uncle, but unless he had gone back to the main trail, there was no way he could have gotten there. They stopped the search a few days later, and my uncle hasn't been found yet, so the family has sort of just accepted the fact that he's probably no longer with us, but it's hard to move on while wondering what the heck happened. Where is his body? How did those people see him when they were not even near where he disappeared? None of it makes sense. Story 7. In June 1989, the quiet Vancouver, British Columbia suburb of Richmond was shocked when a body was found lying in the yard of an abandoned house. The victim was a 44-year-old nurse named Cindy James. She had been drugged and strangled, and her hands and feet had been tied behind her back. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police believed that her death was either an accident or suicide. In the 7 years before she died, Cindy reported nearly 100 incidents of harassment beginning 4 months after she left her husband. 5 were violent physical attacks, while others were whispering to silent phone calls. This got worse after she involved the police. At night, she heard prowlers. Her porch lights were smashed and her phone lines were severed, according to her friend, Agnes Woodcock. She said bizarre notes began to appear on her doorstep. Someone was trying to scare her to death. She became reluctant and frightened to give details. Over time, the police began to doubt her stories. One night, Agnes dropped by Cindy's house for a visit and knocked on the door. There was no answer, so she assumed she was taking her bath. As she investigated, she came across her outside, crouched down with a nylon stocking tied tightly around her neck. She'd gone out to the garage to get a box and someone had grabbed her from behind. All she saw were white sneakers. Cindy moved to a new house, painted her car, and changed her last name. She also hired a private investigator, Ozzy Caban. The police continued their investigation and questioned her several times. Ozzy later reported that she wouldn't tell them the entire story. She would be evasive, would withhold information, and simply would not act as a normal victim would act. Her mother, Tilly Hack, thinks the reason for her daughter's reluctance was that her attacker had threatened her sister and family. By naming him, her family would be killed. One night, Ozzy Caban heard strange sounds coming over a two-way radio he had given Cindy and went straight to her house. He went around the house and found it was locked. Looking through a window, he found her lying on the floor with a paring knife through her hand. She was taken to the hospital, where she later recalled being attacked and a needle going into her arm. Police never took fingerprints from a suspect, and there was no independent corroboration. Cindy saw this person sometimes accompanied by one or two others, or sometimes she said there were 2 or 3 people, but police could never find a suspect. The threatening phone calls continued, but they were too short to trace. There were never ones when the police had 24-hour surveillance on her house for days on end, with up to 14 officers. But when surveillance was off her house, another incident would happen. As police became skeptical of the harassment, her parents believed her attacker was staying away to make them suspicious of her. Eventually, she was found dazed and semi-conscious lying in a ditch 6 miles from her home. She was wearing a man's work boot and glove and suffering from hypothermia. Cuts and bruises covered her body. A black nylon stocking had been tied tightly around her neck. She had no memory of what happened. Agnes Woodcock and her husband Tom stayed with her, and one night heard noises and awoke to the basement in flames and the phone dead. Tom left the residence to alert the neighbors. He saw a man at the curb and asked him to call the fire department. Instead, he simply ran off down the street. The police suspected that Cindy had staged the incident. They found no dust or fingerprints disturbed on the outside of the windowsill. The fire was set inside the home. To set it, it was thought, the perpetrator would have needed to climb through this specific window. It was also considered odd that Cindy still freely walked her dog during the attacks. Her doctor committed her to a local psychiatric ward, believing she was becoming suicidal. 10 weeks later, she left the hospital. Her father, Otto Hack, said that she finally admitted to her family and friends that she knew more than she was saying and would go after her perpetrator herself. On May 25, 1989, 6 years and 7 months after the first threatening phone call, Cindy disappeared. On the same day, her car was found in a neighborhood parking lot. Inside were groceries and a wrapped gift. There was blood on the driver's side door, and items from her wallet were under the car. 2 weeks later, her body was found at the abandoned house. It looked like she had been brutally murdered. Her hands and feet were bound together behind her back. A black nylon stocking was tied tightly around her neck. Yet, an autopsy revealed that she died from an overdose of morphine and other drugs. Police concluded that she had committed suicide. Otto didn't believe she would have been able to stage the scene, but others believed it was possible. In Vancouver, the coroner ruled that her death was not suicide, an accident, or a murder. They determined that she died of an unknown event. Cindy's parents never doubted that their daughter was murdered. Otto believed the police did not investigate the possibility of homicide or somebody murdering her, instead zeroing in on trying to prove that she committed suicide. They believe someone in Vancouver is getting away with murder. Story 8. A childhood friend of mine, whom I'll call Gene, was the only son of an immigrant couple. They had him in his latter years, so he lived a completely sheltered life and had a complete lack of social skills and social development. They had no other family around, only friends, mostly other immigrants from the same country. Gene's father was very well off, but he lived like a miser. So Gene grew up thinking they were middle class, bordering on poor. When Gene was in his 30s, I think, his father passed away from an illness. Shortly after that, his mother was tragically struck by a vehicle and killed as she crossed a busy street. So Gene was left all alone and in charge of a fortune and assets he was ill-prepared to handle. Out of nowhere, a relative from the old country appeared. She was a young, attractive woman, supposedly a distant cousin. Soon, she was seen with Gene here and there, not too often, but often enough that some people took notice. 3 months later, Gene simply vanished. No one knew where he went or why he wasn't around. And now the cousin had control of the fortune. Another friend of the family got concerned and called the local police to report him as a missing person. The guy in charge told the friend to never inquire again about Gene, to better leave this matter alone. No one knows what happened to Gene, but several of us have some guesses. Story 9. It is officially ruled as suicide, but the death night of Stammheim still appears weird. Basically, in mid-70s, Germany, a group of terrorists was held in a prison specifically built for them, the highest security prison, keep that in mind, in the country at that time. The cells were completely soundproof and there was constant surveillance outside of them, yet the inmates somehow were supposed to have smuggled shotguns inside, then coordinated the suicide. One of the men supposedly shot himself, but had no traces of gunpowder on his hands. Another shot himself from a centimeter distance in a way that the bullet exited through his forehead without using a silencer, yet the guards heard nothing. He shot himself with the right hand, yet was left-handed from that incredibly improbable position. The creepiest thing, though, is that a woman survived that after being stabbed 4 times in the chest with a dull knife. To this day, she insists she was being attacked, but in the official version, she stabbed herself in the chest 4 times, with a dull prison knife no less, which would have taken an incredible amount of force. A few days before they died, they told their lawyers they were afraid of being killed after another member of their group committed a highly disputed suicide. That member's brain later turned up in the medical faculty of a university, despite neither her nor her children having consented to that. And that, should they be found with no suicide notes, it would be murder. There were no suicide notes. During the trials of those people, they had been under constant surveillance, and the German government admitted to bugging their cells, and even listening in on conversations with their lawyers. Also worth noting is that during both the suicide of the first member and the death night, auxiliary guards were on duty instead of the regular ones, and there was an unguarded entrance to their tract that the German government claimed to not know of, despite them building that prison specifically for those people. There was a lot of other stuff too, but this is creepy.